Thanks for joining. My name's Kenny. Thanks for the intro, Aaron. So a little bit about me before I get into what this talk is going to be about. I've been working in data professionally for over 6 years now. My most recent job was at Bettercom, the digital mortgage lender. I was working there as a data engineer for the past 2 years, though I've just actually recently left Better to give data freelancing a try. And before that, I worked at Spotify for 4 years. And throughout my career, I've had a wide diversity of roles across data science, data engineering, project management. But I would say, given all of that, I would say data analysis is still where my heart will always be. And that was kind of, it's one of the inspirations for this talk. And just to be clear, when I say data analysis, I'm broadly referring to business intelligence work, like building dashboards or doing ad hoc exploratory analysis for business strategy, mostly internal focus. That's what I'm going to assume data analysis is going to mean in this presentation. And so I found in my experience that talking about what makes good data analysis very challenging. And I think the reason why it's hard to talk about what makes a good data analysis is across company to company, the work is just so different. And people have different expectations of what a data analyst does, what their profile is, and correspondingly, they understand kind of responsibilities differently, and they end up prioritizing different parts of the craft, right? Should a data analyst be more SQL driven? Should they be more, business focused? Should they come from consulting? Should they come from a more technical background? And that makes it really hard, I think, to coalesce around a good sense of principles for what good data analysis is. And, you might find some best practice books and advice on the internet, but I've also found that what I've read a lot of tends to be very just general and vague. It'll say things like a good data analyst should, ensure data quality or, talk to your business stakeholder one-on-one, things that are broadly useful, but maybe not super memorable and don't really stick with you. And so that's kind of what I want to try in this talk. It's called Kiro Dreams of Data, a Sushi-inspired guide to data analysis. And I want to try something kind of funky and share what my data analysis best practices are that I keep in my mind when I do data analysis across my experience through this kind of extended metaphor about sushi. And why sushi, right? Part of this is also inspired by Kimball's book, the sort of classic dimensional modeling book. He uses a restaurant a lot as a metaphor to talk about managing a data warehouse, which I thought is really useful. And it's also inspired just, I think, my experience. I like to cook. I love food. I love sushi. I love travel. So I thought they just, try something new. And now I imagine a lot of these best practices that I'm going to share aren't going to be news to people in this conference, but I do think, these are the things I wish my younger analyst self, when I just started out, wished I had heard. And so the next best thing I guess I can hope for is to share that knowledge with other new analysts who may be out there, or teams that are trying to find a way to communicate what best practices are to their maybe not so technical coworkers. And hopefully I want to do so in a fun and engaging way. Right, so here we go. It's all going to start as so. Imagine we have a fictional sushi chef named Kiro. This is Kiro. Kiro has spent, you can imagine, his whole life mastering the art of sushi making. It's decades of time practicing the craft. And as a result, every piece of sushi he puts together is handled with, extreme care and thought. He knows exactly what it's going to taste like over the years without even having to taste it anymore, just because he's done this so often. His sushi is just phenomenal. And people across the world, every awards body you can imagine, lauds Kiro at his restaurant, and people travel around the world to dine in his establishments. He gets calls from these restaurants offering him crazy consulting fees just to understand what his process is. How did he do it? How is his sushi so good? And, let's say he's making a movie, he's writing a book, talking about it, and I'm here to introduce to you what that Kiro process is. What does he do that makes him so good at what he does? And here it is. If you want to be Kiro and you want to be a master at craft, you need to do 3 things. 1, you need to know your ingredients. You need to record your recipes. And 3, you need to master egg sushi. Know your ingredients, record your recipes, master egg sushi. So on the data side, I'll spoil it for you right now what this means in our craft, right? These are principles that I apply to, you can apply to anything, but this talks about data analysis. And when it comes to data, what this means, the 3 principles to keep in mind and what I think are the pillars of a good data analysis are: 1, knowing where your data comes from; 2, standardizing common logic and creating a culture around data documentation. And 3, focusing on the basics of data analysis over complex methods. And so now in the rest of this talk, I'm going to go into more detail about what I mean with each of these sections. So starting with knowing your ingredients. So if we go back to Kiro's restaurant, every morning Kiro wakes up, he goes to the fish market, he shops for the day's catch. He's looking around at all the different fish vendors. And, you know, me and you might just see a piece of tuna or a piece of salmon or something and say like, oh, that's a piece of fish. But no, Kiro's a master, right? He goes to the stores and he looks at stuff and he finds himself asking these questions. He sees a piece of fish. He asks himself, you know, where did this fish come from? Did it grow up in the Atlantic? Was it farmed in the Pacific? Did this fish live a happy life? You know, who were its parents? Was this fish nurtured? Was it able to have a large area to swim? Was it factory farmed? Was it locally sourced? You know, even down to what is the toro ratio of this fish? Toro being like the fatty belly part of the fish. You know, that's the part of the, you know, I know customers really like that cut. Is this fish going to have a high ratio of that? How do I even know which ones will have that kind of, that have a lot of toro versus other kinds of cuts? And, you know, those are the questions at the end of the day, what knowing your ingredients is. It's asking those kinds of questions. And in the data world, it really just means knowing where your data comes from to the utmost detail. So I want to share an example in the data world of what this knowing your ingredients concept really is. So I'm going to share an example from my experience working at Better Mortgage. So for those of you who don't know, just a quick side note about Better. Better is a digital mortgage lender. You go online and get a mortgage through Better. That's the short pitch. What makes Better unique, arguably, is that they emphasize a strong customer services component that other lenders don't. So what that means is that we have a really, or Better has a really strong customer services team that is there to guide users through what is, you know, a mortgage, typically a very stressful and complex process, by making themselves available on the phone and just, you know, just generally guiding them through that. That's what can be a really complex process. So as you can imagine, we have a lot of analysts at Better trying to understand how good our customer services team is doing. Are we picking up the phone on time? Are we having effective conversations? So one day, a customer services analyst files a bug ticket with the data platform team. This is the team that kind of I'm working on at the time. And they're looking at this table. This is, like you can imagine, the core calls table we have at Better. Every row here is like a call into our internal sales, or into our internal customer services line. And they're doing some analysis. They're trying to understand like some kind of inbound call, you know, success rate kind of metric. And they file a bug report that sounds really urgent. It says, oh, wow, half of these calls don't have any internal Better accounts. So an account ID is this like last column you can imagine is a unique identifier of every potential customer we have Better. And so they're like, oh, this seems like a huge bug. We're not logging accounts with these numbers. And so this is kind of sounds scary because, again, account IDs are kind of the main grain for most of our other tables around customer information and things like that. I think they're running into a lot of missing data problems. A little bit of scrambling. It turns out actually the answer was just on the front page of Better.com. It's just buried kind of at the footer, right? And it turns out, right, here's our customer services sales line. Any person can go to Better.com right now. I'm not saying you should do that right now, but you can find our customer services line and call that number without having to create an account with us. Not just on the front page, there's actually many places across the website where we don't require an account or an email address to actually start a conversation with one of our loan officers. And so the takeaway here is the data analyst reporting this didn't fully understand all the different ways that calls could actually come into our customer service team. And as a result, they just, you know, if you don't understand where the calls are coming into from, and you just don't understand where your data is coming from, how can you reasonably, you know, expect to do your job effectively and sort of model the world to your stakeholders? And so a way around this that we do it better, which we have a nice setup to actually teach people how to know the ingredients, is the sort of engineering team has set up this really high fidelity staging website of Better.com, which allows you to actually go into the staging website and like create a dummy email address and like go through the flow yourself. And the engineers also open up access to that staging database. So this is actually really nice because as a new analyst, you can go through the flow with a fake email address without polluting, you know, prod data, and you can query your own information in that staging database. And it allows you to do this mental model connection of a row of data in a table to a real user interaction or business process, right? I feel like that's so big because too often I see one of the biggest things I see missing among data analysts is they think that like this table they're querying just like fell from the sky perfectly. Like it's, you know, it's exactly what they need for their analysis. It's like, it's a service thing. It's just an obstacle for them to conquer to get to their analysis. But, you know, we have to always remember that data comes from somewhere. It comes from a real person clicking on something or a machine doing something, some business process that humans created. It's just another artifact. And having a tool like that where you can actually go in and test and query your own information, I think is so critical to really help you understand where your data comes from. And so we've taken the time to know your ingredients. We've done that process. Now it's time for you to share that knowledge with the rest of the community, of your coworkers in your community, by recording your recipes. So going back to the restaurant analogy, when it comes to most restaurants, I'm going to talk about recording your recipes a little bit later, but let's think about when you go to most restaurants and you order a salmon sushi. How that sushi is made is actually kind of a black box, right? You know you're ordering some kind of fish and a chef is going in the back and doing something to it, and you come out and you got this like nice looking piece of like salmon nigiri. Especially with, maybe you can imagine what happens if there's a lot of chefs at like bigger restaurants. Maybe these different chefs have different ways of cutting this fish or cleaning it, or they use a different ratio. Maybe some chefs are more generous and give you more fish than others. And we've all know those restaurants, and you kind of have to like plan your day around going when a specific chef is on call. And it's then this weird thing where the quality of your meal actually becomes dependent on just who happens to be working that day, which I think, needless to say, makes a pretty poor dining experience, right? I think if you're a customer of any service, you would expect, regardless of the time of day or who is working, you expect the same quality product. That's just, I think, a sort of business 101 thing if you're providing a service to somebody. So Kiro's restaurant, right? Kiro, the sort of like amazing 3-star Michelin restaurant, they've already figured this out. And the way they get around this inconsistency is they really practice the art of mise en place. So for the cooks out there, mise en place refers to the setup and preparation required before you even start cooking. This is like chopping, cleaning your ingredients, portioning them, all that kind of stuff. And at Kiro's restaurant, you know, this cleaning and preparation is not left to chance or the whims of any given chef. No, when Kiro goes to the fish market and buys a piece of salmon, he doesn't just chuck it in the fridge. He labels it. It's an Alaskan salmon. It was caught this morning at 7:35 a.m. by Fishtown Company Fisheries, so that anybody can go into the fridge and actually pull it out and know exactly what they're looking at. In addition, he doesn't just stop there with the sort of preparation. He also has every single thing he does to that fish before it becomes like a final piece of sushi meticulously documented. He's telling you to make sure you remove the scales with a dull knife, not a sharp knife, because if you use the sharp knife, you might cut the flesh. You know, if you're going to gut the fish, you got to flip it over first. And oh yeah, and if you're filleting this fish, you know, don't just cut it in any old shape. You got to make it 10-inch by 5x5. It's to the level of detail that this master goes through with every single step is so important. Everything is just very cleanly documented. And again, why is he doing this? And this kind of solves, right, the problem I was talking about earlier. With proper mise en place and these recorded recipes down, Kiro can be confident he can take a vacation. He doesn't have to work a certain day, and he knows that his sushi apprentices working at the restaurant can follow those recipes and still deliver very high quality sushi. And so on the data side of things, right, this story is super, I think, relatable. And it's really about ensuring analytics. Analytics is no exception. Consistency is still super important. If one analyst is trying to do the same analysis of something and you are doing the same analysis, you better hope that whatever your stakeholder is seeing is going to see the same insight or the same numbers. And the way we kind of do that, and the way to think about that and ensure that consistency, is through 2 frameworks here: standardizing your transformations that you do to the data, to your raw data, and ensuring a strong data documentation culture, right? So like, and I'll go into what that means a little bit, but any analyst can throw together a SQL query, right? And put it in a dashboard in a few minutes and ship it off, right? But the best analysts take the time to actually document the intermediate cleaning steps they do, and also they take the time to actually write very clearly what their assumptions are, right? No cleaning you do is purely objective. You're always going to be making some assumption, and the best you can do at sort of best anyone can really do is just write that down. And while these steps are important for any analysis, they become so much more crucial if you're looking to scale your analytics capability and scale in terms of people. So this is kind of what happened when I was working at Better. When I started there, it was an analytics community of say like, a dozen people. This is around 2 years ago. But the company has just been so successful and has grown so much that now it's supporting a community from a dozen to over 100. And again, how do you ensure that two teams don't have different results for what would be the same analysis? Well, this is kind of a rough sort of overview of what we did. We basically standardized common transformations in code. So like common joins, doing things like that. We go from this raw to clean job. This is a place where DBT is super helpful and is the kind of our primary workhorse for this kind of stuff. And we also just invested more in data documentation and setting standards for what raw to clean looks like. And this way, basically, downstream analysts can just look at clean data, and then we get a little bit more confidence in standardization as data moves from clean to derived information and business logic. So here's kind of an example, just raw to clean job we would write for this generic raw orders table. And so the kind of top thing here, we say we have some raw table called orders from like Fivetran or some other process copying data into our data warehouse. The first step we do here is we standardize the common transformation here. In this case, we turn an empty string into a null for this category column. And then the second step, which is oftentimes the most looked over and maybe lowest quality, is we enrich the data with documentation, explicitly doing things like what clean steps were taken. In this case, we can say that we're converting empty strings to nulls. The primary key here is this ID column. And maybe you might also want to add in information into this YAML around where your raw data comes from, what the loader was. If you've read, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Claire's excellent discourse post called How We Structure Our Projects. This kind of raw to clean layer is really heavily inspired by a lot of the ideas in that post. They talk, I think, especially like the staging or kind of base model setup. And then basically that raw to clean job outputs this clean data set into this new clean schema. And you can go even a step further here and start to use this in a form of access control or governance. So now we have this data kind of separated out. We can do things like restrict our BI tool. We're using Looker at Better, but you can use any BI tool that's querying on top of your data sets. You can permission it to only query from clean or derived data. And so this is nice because it ensures for data novices who maybe are new and only access data through this BI tool it ensures that they're only accessing standard transformations and logic that is pre-vetted. It prevents them from making these false assumptions on raw data that I was talking about that are so common. And B, we can make a guarantee. If you're a data producer, you can say, oh, you want to use the clean data? Well, guess what? That's great because we can guarantee that every single table here has a corresponding piece of data documentation you can access at docsbetter.com. And so, seemingly simple steps, but in short, kind of the output here is we basically turned a bunch of knowledge and logic that was siloed both in people's heads and copy pasted across hundreds of queries, and we recorded those recipes. That's essentially what we did, and we recorded them in a version controlled and transparent way. And again, seemingly simple thing, but at the end of the day, that's the only thing that's going to help you really increase at a step level your confidence in consistent analysis across an analytics community that is scaling very quickly. And now that we've talked about knowing your ingredients, we've recorded our recipes of how they've moved across the system. Now that we have these ingredients in place, it's time for us to actually start cooking, right? We've done all this work, now it's start cooking. But before we even reach for the fish and fancy stuff, we must remember the first and foremost master egg sushi. And so for this metaphor, I'm going to actually use a real restaurant as inspiration here. So I'm going to play a clip from Jiro Dreams of Sushi. This is a documentary. This is kind of the inspiration for the title of this talk. Jiro Dreams of Sushi is a documentary about Jiro Ono. He's this 85-year-old sushi master. And the documentary is the story of his restaurant. It's tiny 3-star Michelin with like 10 seats. It's an omakase, like sort of chef's choice sushi restaurant in Tokyo. It's pretty widely regarded as the best sushi restaurant on the planet. And it's just a really like kind of emotional and it's just like a really fascinating and downright like kind of heartwarming emotional movie. I'd highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. I'm going to play this short clip, the short 2-minute clip, which covers a section of the movie. It's a section with one of Jiro's apprentices, telling his story of how he mastered making egg sushi. And I should stop it there for now in the interest of time. But I think it's just like, to me, I think it's like that last sentence around like, I made 200 failed egg sushis over 4 months and then I cried when they finally accepted it. It's just absolutely like, it's like both crazy to me and also just super inspirational that this person devoted this much time honing skills for what at the surface level seems like a simple dish. It's just egg on a piece of rice. And I think contrast that with today's fast-paced tech culture, right? As opposed to spending all 4 months mastering something simple, we're conditioned to want to become experts in increasingly shorter amounts of time, right? Companies are like, look no further than the data science boot camps. We're going from 5 weeks to becoming a data science person to 5 days. And companies are just, at the end of the day, they're just racing to the bottom to meet our sort of increasingly ravenous appetite to learn things faster. And now I don't want to discriminate or knock on data science boot camps or like boot camp culture. I actually do think boot camps are great overall. They offer a lot of tangible value that I think a lot of formal education has kind of failed at. But I want to just basically the point of this last thing is for people that do choose this route, it's really important to go in with a measured sense of humility and to make sure that you really carve out time to focus on the basics and not get sort of, seduced by a lot of complex methods, machine learning, right? You shouldn't really be spending a lot of that time or championing yourself as a machine learning expert if you've only taken, what amounts to like a very short amount of time. Just remember, right? Like it's important to remember that the basics, you're never really done learning the basics. And that, something things so foundational as like knowing SQL really well, knowing how to communicate data very clearly in a line chart or scatter plot. Those are things we can always continue to be better at. And you're never really done and you're never above doing that work, regardless of what your degrees or your background is. And and at the end of the day, I think those simple solutions end up having the most impact more than a lot of complex solutions do. Like we can all probably think of an example where someone asked for this complex predictive model and all they needed was a scatter plot showing these two variables together, right? And I think, you're just going to be really surprised actually how far you can go if you invest the time learning and really mastering those few basic skills. And so just to wrap up, this BKIRO framework, 3 things to remember in any craft, but I think in data as well. 1, know your ingredients. So don't assume things about your source data is basically what that means. Know where your data comes from. 2, record your recipes. In other words, write down your logic and documentation of your data and the steps you took to get to where you need to go. And lastly, make sure to master egg sushi, right? Devote enough time and focus on the basics first before you move on to jumping to the more complex things. So, we can't all be Kiro, right? It takes a lifetime to truly master any craft. And it's important, to remember that even in data, we live in such a new industry that we're all going to have this kind of like feeling that there's so much to learn. So, we can't all be masters. It's going to take time. Doesn't matter if you're an undergrad, coming out looking for a job, or you're someone you're a vet and you're just trying to keep up with like the latest cloud stuff, it can be daunting. But even if we can't all be masters, it's important to remember that if you can just follow these kind of 3 simple steps, knowing your ingredients, recording your recipes, mastering egg sushi, then you too can learn to cook.